Hello, welcome again. This is Moshe Shulman from Judaism's Answer. This is actually the third talk we're having as a general introduction. The last one I talked about what the Tanakh is and why we have the books. I encourage you to go over it and understand the issues there. But we're going to continue now. What I'd like to discuss now is how do we know what a verse means? This is very, very significant. You know, there's Christian interpretations and all kinds of things, and there's all kinds of arguments about what verses really mean. So the question is, how do we know what a verse means? Now, in the last discussion, the last talk we had, I talked about what the Tanakh is and how it deals with has a personal relationship to Jewish people because it's our ancestors. So in a sense, when we look at it, the most important thing when we see it is, what is it saying? What is what we call the pshat, the simple meaning of it? And that's really what I want to talk about now. How do we know what a verse really means? And the truth of the matter is, it's really simple. It's context. Anytime you read a book, whenever you want to know what something means, when it says the word he did something, how do you know who he is? From the context. Everything is known from its context. There are things you can use to help you out, but basically that's all you know. Now, context isn't one thing. There's actually different types of contexts. And when we discuss it, and certainly when you hear something from a Christian or from a Jewish commentary, you have to have in mind, there really are four basic contexts that are involved. There's what I call the exegetical context, the historical, the general, and the literary. So what are these? Very simple. Exegetical context is really simply this. When we do exegesis, which is to explain what a verse is, we come to this with some presupposed ideas. Now, when I say presupposed, it doesn't mean that these were made up or anything like that, but there are certain things that we understand that we bring to it. And so when we bring to verses, Judaism has them also. So let me give you just a couple of examples of that. For example, in the book of Ecclesiastes, what we call Koheles, at the very end, it says that the end of the matter is, everything being heard, you should fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole purpose of man. For God shall bring every action to judgment concerning every hidden thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So Judaism has always understood that there is going to be reward and punishment in the world to come somehow, based on how you acted. And the statement in Koheles and Ecclesiastes is the simplest example of it. So that when we approach the Tanakh, we approach it with a certain understanding, a certain theology, Hebrew the word hashkufa, that tells us that, you are judged by your actions and what you do. Similarly, for example, the story of Cain. After he's killed his brother, God tells him that if you do good, it'll be acceptable. But if you don't, then sin is waiting at your door, but you can overcome it. So we see from this that there's a concept of free choice. Everybody has a choice to choose between good and evil, and that we actually have the ability to do good. These are exegetical contexts that Judaism brings whenever we look at a verse. We understand that God is interested in our actions, and we are judged by them. And also that God tells us that we are actually free and have the ability to actually not sin and do things. Christianity obviously has some differences on those points of view. I'm not bringing this for the argument. In later talks we'll actually get into it more and it'll be discussed. I'm only bringing it to understand the concept of exegetical context. There's a context based on certain things that you know from beforehand. Christians bringing the exegetical context from the New Testament are going to have a whole bunch of things that the Tanakh did not agree with, and that leads to many differences. The next context, which is extremely important, is called historical context. Every book is speaking in a certain time. So for example, in the last discussion we talked about Isaiah, where Isaiah talked about the people sitting in that time. Well, in Isaiah 1, it sets your historical context. It says, these are the words that Isaiah said during the kingdom of certain people. He brings which kings that they were. Now, the important thing is to understand that when he says these kings, there's a historical situation involved. So if you really want to know who he's talking to, there's certain other books in the Bible you have to look at. So, for example, to understand who Isaiah is talking about, you need to look in the second book of Kings, from chapters 15 to 20, or the second book of Chronicles, chapters 26 to 32, because that is a period covered by those kings. And once you understand the historical situation, what's going on, you have a little bit more of an insight into Isaiah. And this specifically deals with one of the important verses that's there, Isaiah 7:14. In the beginning of Isaiah 7, it gives you the context. It says, it was in the days of Ahaz. Ahaz was a specific king. If you want to know about King Ahaz, what do? You look in the second chapter of Kings, book 16, or the second book of Chronicles, chapter 28, and read there what happened during that time, the political situation, the war situation, so that you will understand exactly what was going on in chapter 7, and you will understand exactly the questions, the problem, what's going on. Otherwise, it's very difficult to understand what Isaiah is talking about. The third one is called the general context. The general context is usually what we mean when somebody says context without any kind of descriptor to that. When we read a verse, a psalm, for example, and we look at a verse in a psalm. Now, it has to be understood that, except for the book of Proverbs, every book there, chapter, whatever, every psalm is a thing as a whole. So if you look at a verse of Psalms, you need to see the verse in the context of the whole psalm. Where does this fit in? What's it trying to say? Psalms are not proverbs. Psalms are songs, and they have a relationship from the whole psalm throughout. And the same thing has to do with passages and verses in the Tanakh. They sit into a certain context. That is your general context. All right? The final context is called literary context. Literary context is essentially where most of the intention is given when we do in polemics or apologetics. Polemics is when we attack other people's religion. Apologetics is when we defend our own. Essentially, that's what it is. And what it is basically, what wording means, styles, different things that have to do with actually the literary context, the literary content that exists there. Now, we find that many times when we look at what Christians write, they ignore all of this. And in our talks, which we're going to have, we're not going to do that. We're going to be very clear and specific and try, anytime we talk about verse, to really deal with the contexts, what they are, and show what they mean. Because without dealing with the verse in its context, you really cannot know what it means. And I cannot emphasize this strongly enough, because this is one of the areas where, from all my discussions with Christians are basically clueless. They don't really understand it. They come with preconceived, and the whole things are preconceived. But if you look at it from recognizing exegetical context, from the exegetical context for the Tanakh, and look at it from historical, the general, and the literary context there, you will go a very long way to understanding what the verse is about. And in fact, if you look at Jewish commentators, you will see how these things play out in their commentaries themselves, giving us a way of understanding what the simple meaning is. Thank you very much, and I hope you had a good night. Remember, if you have a question, please send it to projecttorah@gmail.com. And as I said, we will collect questions later on. The next discussion I'm going to have is a series of talks discussing what the real Messiah is.